It lasted less than 20 seconds. No dialogue, no dramatic soundtrack, no carefully staged angles. Just a brief, unguarded moment captured by a phone camera and released into the digital wild without warning. By the time Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban became aware of it, the clip had already gone viral. Millions of views, endless rewatches, and an avalanche of judgments from people who believed that a fragment of footage gave them the right to define an entire marriage. In a modern celebrity ecosystem, privacy does not collapse all at once. It erodes slowly, frame by frame, algorithm by algorithm. The viral clip did not show a scandal. It did not expose betrayal, conflict, or wrongdoing. What it offered instead was ambiguity, and ambiguity is the most dangerous fuel on the internet. A pause that lingered a second too long. A glance interpreted as distance. Body language frozen and dissected by strangers who mistook confidence for expertise. Within hours, the narrative hardened. Reaction videos appeared, each one more certain than the last. Relationship analysts, self-proclaimed psychologists, and anonymous commenters announced that something was wrong. Silence was read as guilt. Neutral expressions were labeled as strain. The absence of clarification became proof that there was something to hide. The truth was irrelevant. Engagement was everything. Nicole Kidman had spent her entire career learning how to open herself emotionally on screen while keeping her private life fiercely protected. Vulnerability was her craft, not her obligation. Keith Urban, equally seasoned, had rebuilt himself publicly after years of struggle, addiction, and reinvention. Together, they had cultivated a marriage that resisted spectacle. No performative affection, no oversharing, just consistency. And in a culture addicted to extremes, consistency is invisible until it is questioned. As the clip spread, so did projection. Old narratives were dragged back into the light. Keith was framed through the lens of his past, with commenters reviving familiar insinuations about instability and emotional withdrawal. Nicole was scrutinized for her expressions, her posture, her silence. A woman who had played countless roles was suddenly denied the right to exist without performing reassurance. What made the moment uniquely cruel was how ordinary it was. The clip captured nothing extraordinary, only a human interaction stripped of its context. In another era, such a moment would have vanished into memory. In this one, it became permanent content. Slowed down, zoomed in, reframed, reposted. The internet does not observe, it interrogates. And it does so without patience or mercy. Behind the scenes, the couple faced a familiar dilemma with no correct answer. Address the speculation and risk amplifying it, or remain silent and allow strangers to write the story for them. Every option carried damage. To explain was to legitimize the noise. To ignore it was to watch the narrative metastasize. This is the quiet violence of viral culture. It forces participation even when silence is chosen. Friends later noticed subtle changes. More caution in public spaces. Fewer spontaneous moments. A visible tightening of boundaries. Not between Nicole and Keith, but between their private selves and the world watching them. For an actor whose power lies in emotional exposure, this constant self-monitoring was corrosive. For a musician whose recovery had been built on honesty, the return of judgment felt like an old ghost knocking without invitation. Eventually, the clip was replaced by another controversy, another frozen expression, another public figure caught mid-breath. The internet moved on, as it always does. But the cost did not vanish with the views. It lingered quietly in the recalibration of trust, in the awareness that no moment is ever truly small again. In Hollywood, scandals are expected. Careers are built to withstand them. What is harder to survive are moments that are not scandals at all, only fragments misread by millions. For Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, the viral clip did not change who they were. It changed how carefully they had to exist in a world where every second can be judged and no explanation is ever enough. What the public never sees is the aftermath. Not the trending graphs or the comment counts, but the quiet recalculations that happen once the doors close and the noise keeps roaring outside. In the days following the clip's explosion, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban did what most couples would do when confronted with a distorted mirror of their lives. They talked, not about the clip itself, but about what it represented. The loss of control, the realization that even silence could be weaponized. For Nicole, the experience reopened an old tension she had learned to manage but never truly escape. Acting had always demanded emotional honesty, but fame demanded emotional restraint. The viral moment collapsed that boundary. Suddenly, everyday expressions were no longer neutral. A thoughtful pause became suspicious. A tired glance became evidence. She found herself anticipating the camera, even when none were visible, a reflex born not of vanity, but of self-protection. The world had proven it could turn anything into a verdict. Keith Urban processed the moment differently. Years earlier, he had learned how quickly public narratives could become cages. Recovery had taught him the value of clarity and truth, yet the clip offered neither space nor patience for either. He was not being judged for words spoken or actions taken, but for assumptions projected onto him. In some corners of the internet, the old storyline resurfaced effortlessly. Past struggles repackaged as present danger. Familiar labels reused because they were convenient. What cut deepest was not the cruelty, but the confidence with which strangers spoke. Millions felt entitled to diagnose the state of a marriage they had never witnessed. They spoke in absolutes. They spoke in conclusions. And they spoke with the certainty that only distance can provide. The internet rewards conviction, not caution. And so nuance died quietly, buried beneath thumbnails and reaction videos. Inside their home, the couple faced an unspoken shift. Not a fracture between them, but a shared awareness that the outside world had crossed another line. They had always known fame came with scrutiny. What they had underestimated was the intimacy of modern surveillance. The idea that a moment meant for no one could be owned by everyone. That context could be stripped so completely that truth became optional. Professionally, the ripple effects were subtle but real. Public appearances were reconsidered. Interactions were choreographed with greater care. Not for performance, but for defense. There's a difference. One seeks admiration. The other seeks survival. When every movement can be slowed, replayed, and interpreted, spontaneity becomes a liability. Authenticity, ironically, becomes a risk. Friends described a renewed sense of guarding. Not coldness, but boundaries drawn more firmly. Laughter still existed. Affection remained. But the margin for error had narrowed. The couple understood that the internet did not require facts to feel satisfied. It required momentum. And momentum feeds on silence as easily as it feeds on statements. There was also a deeper, more unsettling realization. The clip had not gone viral because it revealed something shocking. It went viral because it allowed viewers to project their own fears onto a famous couple. Doubt sells. Disillusionment performs well. Watching a stable relationship appear to crack, even falsely, reassures audiences that no one is immune. That even icons are fragile. That security is an illusion. In private moments, Nicole reportedly reflected on the cost of visibility. Not the glamorous cost discussed in interviews, but the psychological tax of being constantly interpreted. When every expression is read as a message, silence becomes exhausting. You are always communicating, even when you do not intend to. Keith, too, recognized the emotional weight of being permanently legible to strangers, of knowing that your past can be summoned at any time by someone who needs a storyline. The clip eventually stopped trending. It always does. Another moment replaced it. Another face. Another assumption. But the lesson lingered. The couple did not emerge broken. They emerged adjusted, more aware, more careful, more deliberate in deciding what the world gets to see and what it does not. This is the unseen cost of viral culture. Not scandal, not collapse, but contraction. The slow shrinking of what is freely shared. The quiet decision to protect what matters most from a crowd that confuses access with understanding. For Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, the viral clip was not a crisis of marriage. It was a crisis of exposure. A reminder that in a world addicted to judgment, love must sometimes retreat to survive. And that the strongest relationships are not those that perform reassurance, but those that endure without explanation. By the third week, the clip was no longer everywhere. It had slipped from the front page, replaced by fresher outrage and newer faces. But in Hollywood, disappearance does not mean erasure. It means absorption. Moments like this do not vanish. They sink into the collective memory of an industry that never fully forgets, only waits. Inside studio corridors and agency offices, the conversation had already shifted. No one spoke about the clip directly. They rarely do. Instead, it surfaced in coded language. Concerns about optics, discussions about timing, gentle suggestions to keep appearances minimal for now. Hollywood has mastered the art of indirect pressure. It does not accuse, it advises. And those advisories, though politely framed, carry weight. For Nicole, this meant navigating a professional landscape that suddenly felt more cautious around her. Not hostile, not dismissive, but alert. Executives who once spoke freely now measured their words. Interviews were approached with a new sensitivity, as if any personal anecdote might reignite speculation. The irony was unmistakable. A woman celebrated for emotional depth was being quietly encouraged to flatten herself for safety. Keith felt a parallel shift in the music world. Conversations with collaborators remained warm, but there was an undercurrent of watchfulness. The industry that had once praised his transparency now treated it as something to be managed carefully. Honesty, it seemed, was welcome only when it aligned with stability. When ambiguity entered the picture, even falsely, it became something to contain. What the public rarely understands is that Hollywood does not punish scandal directly. It punishes uncertainty. Executives fear unpredictability more than controversy. And a viral clip, stripped of context and endlessly debated, introduces a variable no one can control. Not because it reveals truth, but because it invites speculation without limits. Meanwhile, the internet continued to behave as if the story were unfinished. Even as attention drifted, comments lingered beneath old posts. Questions resurfaced during unrelated appearances. A casual smile prompted renewed analysis. A quiet moment reignited old assumptions. Viral culture does not require continuity. It thrives on fragments. The most damaging aspect was not the accusation itself, but the normalization of entitlement. Millions had watched a private moment and felt authorized to demand explanation. When none came, frustration followed, as if access had been granted and then unfairly revoked. The audience, conditioned by constant visibility, struggled to accept that some moments were never meant for them. Within their marriage, this external noise forced an unexpected internal reckoning, not of trust, but of strategy. How much of themselves could they afford to show? What was safe to share? What was no longer worth the risk? These were not questions born of conflict between them, but of a shared defense against a world that mistook proximity for intimacy. Friends noticed that the couple became more selective, not withdrawn. Gatherings were smaller. Public gestures more deliberate. Not colder, but controlled. There is a difference between privacy and secrecy. Privacy protects. Secrecy hides. What they chose was protection. Hollywood history is filled with couples undone not by infidelity or betrayal, but by relentless interpretation. Relationships collapse under the weight of being constantly explained. Every denial becomes suspicious. Every confirmation becomes performative. The healthiest response, paradoxically, is often refusal. Refusal to clarify. Refusal to reassure. Refusal to participate. Yet refusal comes at a cost. It invites myth, and myth spreads faster than fact. In the absence of narrative, others will invent one. This is the unspoken contract of celebrity life. Silence is not neutral. It is provocative. As weeks turned into months, the clip faded into background noise. But its residue remained. It altered how moments were lived, not just how they were seen. Spontaneity became measured. Public affection became strategic. The line between genuine interaction and perceived messaging grew thinner. Still, there was resilience in that adjustment. Not resignation, but adaptation. The couple did not retreat from the world. They recalibrated their relationship with it. Fame had always demanded compromise. Viral culture simply changed the terms. In the end, the clip did not expose a fracture. It exposed a system that feeds on ambiguity, rewards judgment, and confuses access with understanding. A system where a moment can be consumed without consent and debated without consequence. For Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, the lesson was not about love under pressure. It was about survival in an era where visibility is compulsory and interpretation is unavoidable. The strongest choice was not to explain, but to endure. To protect what mattered from a world that demanded answers it was never entitled to receive. Hollywood has always loved a pattern. Long before smartphones and social platforms, it studied couples the way it studied box office numbers, searching for signs of longevity or collapse. In earlier decades, the damage came from headlines and paparazzi photos. Today, it comes from something more intimate and far less forgiving. Moments that appear unscripted, imperfect, and therefore endlessly interpretable. History offers no shortage of examples. Marriages once thought unbreakable unraveled under the pressure of public interpretation. Not because something terrible happened behind closed doors, but because something trivial happened in public and was magnified beyond recognition. A cold glance, a missed handhold, a silence mistaken for resentment. Each time, the story followed a familiar arc. Speculation hardened into belief. Belief transformed into expectation. And expectation eventually became a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is the danger Nicole and Keith quietly understood. Viral moments do not merely reflect relationships. They reshape them by altering the environment in which they must exist. When a couple becomes a subject of collective judgment, even briefly, the space around them changes. Friends speak more carefully. Colleagues grow cautious. Public encounters become tests rather than experiences. The industry rarely acknowledges this dynamic openly, but it adjusts to it instinctively. Casting decisions become more conservative. Publicists recalibrate messaging. Appearances are weighed not by authenticity, but by risk. The marriage itself becomes a variable in professional calculations, whether fair or not. Stability is prized, but only when it appears uncomplicated. Ambiguity, even benign, is seen as a liability. What makes this era uniquely ruthless is speed. In the past, couples had time to respond, to course correct, to let a moment fade naturally. Now, judgment arrives instantly and globally. There is no grace period, no buffer between perception and verdict. The first interpretation often becomes the dominant one, regardless of accuracy. For Nicole and Keith, the challenge was not to disprove rumors, but to resist being reshaped by them. Many Hollywood couples before them failed at this point. Some overcorrected, flooding the public with reassurance until authenticity dissolved into performance. Others retreated entirely, allowing myths to flourish unchecked. Both strategies carry consequences. The more subtle path is endurance without explanation. It is the hardest choice because it denies the audience the resolution it craves. It refuses the narrative arc of confession, denial, or redemption. It accepts misunderstanding as a cost of survival. Few couples manage it successfully, not because it is wrong, but because it is exhausting. Behind the scenes, endurance requires alignment. Not constant agreement, but shared priorities. A decision, spoken or unspoken, that the relationship itself matters more than how it is perceived. This is where many marriages fracture. Not under scandal, but under the endless labor of maintaining an image that no longer feels real. Observers who expected fallout from the viral clip misread the silence that followed. They mistook restraint for strain. In reality, restraint was strategy. It was a refusal to let a distorted moment dictate the terms of a life built over decades. The absence of public explanation was not avoidance. It was boundary setting. Still, boundaries do not erase consequences. The couple's public world became narrower. Moments once shared freely were now filtered. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. When the cost of exposure outweighs its benefit, discretion becomes an act of preservation. Hollywood rarely celebrates this kind of strength because it lacks spectacle. There is no dramatic breakup, no tearful interview, no triumphant reconciliation arc. There's only continuity, and continuity does not trend. Yet continuity is often the quiet victory. It denies the system the collapse it anticipates. It resists the narrative that every moment must resolve into drama. It insists that some stories are not for consumption. The viral clip, when viewed through this lens, becomes less a threat and more a test. Not of love, but of priorities. Of whether a marriage can exist without constant validation. Of whether two people can remain anchored to each other while the world tries to pull meaning from every gesture. For Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, the answer did not arrive as a statement or a spectacle. It arrived slowly through consistency, through showing up, not to cameras, but to each other, through allowing the noise to pass without letting it redefine the core of what they had built. In an industry trained to equate visibility with relevance, choosing durability over display is a radical act. It does not silence judgment, but it outlasts it. And sometimes, outlasting the noise is the only way to keep what matters intact. When the noise finally thins, what remains is rarely the moment that caused it. What remains is the residue, the habits that changed, the instincts sharpened, the quiet decisions made without announcement. For Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, the aftermath of the viral clip did not end with headlines fading. It continued in the smallest recalibrations of daily life, the kind that never trend and never get explained. There's a myth that public scrutiny either destroys relationships or strengthens them. The truth is more subtle. It alters them. It introduces a permanent awareness that the private self must be defended, not just from intrusion, but from interpretation. After the clip, moments were no longer neutral. They carried potential. And potential, when misread, becomes risk. Yet there was also an unexpected clarity that emerged from the experience. The couple learned precisely what the public could not be trusted with. Not because the public was malicious, but because it was conditioned to consume fragments as conclusions. In that realization, boundaries stopped feeling like loss and began to feel like relief. Friends close to them observed a steadier rhythm, not a colder one. Fewer explanations, less anticipation of reaction, more emphasis on what did not need to be shared. It was not a withdrawal from the world, but a narrowing of the doorway. Access became intentional. This shift mattered because both Nicole and Keith had built careers on connection, on inviting audiences into emotional spaces, on sharing pieces of themselves through art. The viral clip forced a distinction between artistic vulnerability and personal exposure. One is offered, the other is taken. Confusing the two had consequences. In Hollywood, couples are often remembered for how they fall apart, not for how they endure. The industry has an appetite for collapse. It fits narrative structures neatly. What it does not know how to frame is longevity without performance. A marriage that continues without explanation offers no spectacle, no arc, no payoff. It simply exists. That existence, however, becomes its own quiet statement. In refusing to clarify, the couple refused to teach the world that access guarantees answers. In refusing to perform reassurance, they refused to reward speculation. This did not silence judgment. Nothing does. But it changed its relevance. Over time, the clip transformed from an accusation into a footnote. Not because it was disproven, but because it was outlived. New projects arrived. New music. New roles. Public appearances resumed, not with defiance, but with normalcy. Normalcy, in the long run, is disarming. What lingered most was not fear but discernment, a sharpened sense of when to speak and when not to, when silence protects and when it costs too much. This discernment is not visible to audiences, but it shapes everything. It determines how interviews are navigated, how questions are redirected, how much of a smile is offered, and how much is kept. The viral moment had promised revelation. It delivered distortion, but it also delivered something else, unintended and unwelcome, a test of priorities. Faced with a choice between narrative control and relational integrity, the couple chose the latter. That choice does not make for compelling thumbnails. It does not satisfy curiosity, but it sustains a life. In a culture that equates explanation with honesty, refusal is often mislabeled as avoidance. In reality, refusal can be an assertion of selfhood. It is a declaration that some truths do not require public validation to remain true. That love does not need to be narrated to be real. As years pass, moments like the viral clip are rarely remembered in detail. What is remembered, if anything, is the outcome. Whether the relationship dissolved as predicted or persisted despite the noise. Whether the couple allowed the world to define them or quietly reclaimed authorship of their own story. For Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, the answer was not delivered in a statement or an interview. It was delivered through continuity, through choosing to live forward rather than explain backward, through understanding that the cost of fame is not exposure itself, but the expectation that exposure grants entitlement. In the end, the clip did not expose a fracture in a marriage. It exposed the fragility of privacy in a world that treats access as ownership. The judgment came quickly. The consequences lasted longer. But so did the resolve to protect what mattered. When the internet moved on, it left behind a lesson rarely acknowledged, that survival in the age of viral judgment is not about winning the narrative. It is about refusing to let the narrative become the center of your life. And sometimes, the most powerful response to millions of judgments is to keep living as if they were never owed an answer. By the time the clip had fully dissolved into the background noise of the internet, something more permanent had taken its place. Not a rumor, not a scar, but a reckoning. One that did not belong solely to the couple at its center, but to the culture that had consumed it with such certainty. The moment had asked a question no one wanted to answer honestly. When did watching become ownership? Modern celebrity is built on a contradiction. Audiences are invited closer than ever, encouraged to feel intimacy through interviews, behind-the-scenes footage, and curated glimpses of domestic life. Yet when that invitation is mistaken for consent, the relationship fractures. The viral clip was never meant to be a message. It was transformed into one because millions demanded meaning where none had been offered. This demand reveals an uncomfortable truth about spectatorship. The public does not merely observe, it participates. It edits, interprets, amplifies. It supplies motive, emotion, and outcome. In doing so, it assumes a role once reserved for storytellers. The problem is not curiosity. It is entitlement, the belief that visibility cancels the right to context. For celebrities, this creates a moral imbalance. Their humanity becomes conditional, granted only when it satisfies narrative expectations. Deviations are punished. Ambiguity is treated as provocation. Silence is reframed as deception. The viral clip operated within this imbalance perfectly. It offered no clarity and therefore became a canvas for projection. What followed was not a failure of public relations, but a failure of restraint. The speed at which judgment arrived left no room for doubt, no allowance for normalcy, no patience for the idea that not every moment carries meaning. This is the ethical cost of a culture optimized for reaction. It does not pause to ask whether it should speak, only whether it can. Inside this system, celebrities learn a harsh lesson early. The more human you appear, the more vulnerable you become. The more ordinary the moment, the greater the risk of misinterpretation. Authenticity, once celebrated, becomes hazardous when removed from its natural environment. A private moment, is not designed to survive public scrutiny. It is designed to exist, then pass. The couple at the center of this storm did not respond with outrage or explanation. They responded with absence, an absence that forced the question back onto the audience. Why was an answer expected? What right had been violated by silence? And who, exactly, was owed reassurance? These questions linger uncomfortably because they expose a shift in cultural norms. Privacy is no longer assumed. It must be defended, and defense is often mistaken for guilt. In this landscape, the ethical burden falls disproportionately on those with the least control. Once a moment is captured and shared, ownership transfers instantly. Consent becomes irrelevant after the fact. This dynamic does not end with celebrities. It sets a precedent. If public figures can be dissected so freely, ordinary people are not far behind. Viral culture does not distinguish between fame and humanity. It only distinguishes between visibility and obscurity. The lesson is clear and unsettling. Anyone can become content without warning. The clip, in hindsight, was never about marriage. It was about boundaries, about whether society can tolerate the idea that some things are not for consumption. That access does not equal understanding. That interpretation without context is not insight, but intrusion. There is no resolution to this tension, only choices. Individuals choose how much to share. Audiences choose how much to demand. Platforms choose what to reward. In this case, the reward went to speculation, not restraint. To certainty, not humility. The enduring response from the couple was not defiance, but continuity. A quiet insistence that life does not need to be justified to remain valid. That love does not require a press release. That silence can be an ethical stance rather than an evasion. As the years move forward, the viral clip will likely be remembered, if at all, as a brief disturbance. What will matter more is what it represented at the moment it occurred. A test of how far the public would go when given access without context, and a reminder of how easily judgment replaces understanding. The cost was real, even if invisible. A tightening of boundaries, a recalibration of trust, a clearer line between what is shared and what is protected. These are not losses. They are adaptations, necessary ones in a world that confuses proximity with permission. In the end, the most telling outcome was not collapse, confession, or spectacle. It was endurance, the refusal to let a misread moment define a life. The choice to protect the private against a system that profits from exposure. The viral clip offered no truth. The response to it revealed many. About fame, about ethics, about the hunger to judge, and about the quiet power of choosing not to explain what was never owed an explanation in the first place. Time does what outrage cannot. It softens edges. It rearranges priorities. It exposes which moments were truly consequential and which merely felt urgent. Long after the clip stopped circulating, long after the comment sections fell silent, a quieter process continued. Memory began to edit itself. In the public imagination, the viral moment slowly lost specificity. Details blurred. The exact expressions were forgotten. What remained was a vague recollection that something had once been off, a residue of doubt with no clear origin. This is how viral judgment lingers. It does not persist as evidence, but as atmosphere, an untraceable impression that colors perception without announcing itself. For the couple at the center of it, this shift was both a relief and a warning. Relief because the intensity had passed. Warning because misinterpretation rarely disappears completely. It changes form. It becomes background noise rather than confrontation. A faint hum beneath applause. A shadow that follows without demanding attention. In professional spaces, this meant learning to live with assumptions that were never spoken aloud. Not accusations, but hesitations. Not rejection, but recalibration. In Hollywood, reputations are not damaged only by scandal. They're shaped by whispers, by what people think they know but cannot quite explain. The clip had introduced such a whisper, and whispers have long lives. Yet there was also a counterforce at work. Consistency. Over time, it did what arguments could not. New films premiered. New music toured. Public moments accumulated that contradicted the narrative simply by existing. Not loudly, not defensively, just steadily. The story that had been imposed began to feel outdated, then irrelevant. This is the paradox of viral culture. It claims permanence, yet it struggles against duration. It thrives on immediacy, not endurance. The longer something lasts without collapsing, the harder it becomes to sustain a narrative of imminent failure. Stability, when given time, dismantles speculation quietly. Still, the internal impact remained. Once you have experienced mass judgment without cause, you do not fully return to innocence. There is a before and an after. Before, moments are lived. After, they are evaluated in advance. The knowledge that anything can be extracted, reframed, and consumed changes how presence is experienced. You are never entirely unaware again. This awareness does not necessarily breed fear. Often, it breeds discernment. A clearer understanding of what is worth sharing and what must be protected. A recognition that not all openness is generosity, and not all privacy is withdrawal. In this way, the aftermath became instructive rather than paralyzing. The public rarely witnesses this maturation because it is subtle. It does not announce itself. There are no statements about growth, no interviews about lessons learned. Growth happens off camera, in decisions made quietly, in invitations declined without explanation, in moments chosen for meaning rather than visibility. Culturally, the episode left behind a question that remains unresolved. Has the appetite for judgment outpaced the capacity for empathy? When millions participate in dissecting a moment, responsibility diffuses until no one feels accountable. Harm becomes abstract. Consequence becomes invisible. And yet, the cumulative effect is real. The viral clip was consumed as entertainment, but it operated as surveillance. It reminded those watching that visibility is a risk, not a privilege. That being seen does not guarantee being understood. And that misunderstanding, once multiplied, becomes its own form of pressure. As audiences move on to the next moment, the next subject, the cycle repeats. But occasionally, a story resists the expected ending. It neither implodes nor performs redemption. It simply continues. In doing so, it exposes the limits of viral power. Not everything can be broken by attention alone. The quiet endurance of a life lived beyond explanation becomes, in itself, a counter-narrative. It suggests that meaning does not always emerge from commentary. That relationships are not obligated to resolve public curiosity. That some truths persist without ever being clarified. In retrospect, the clip did not define a marriage. It revealed a culture. One eager to assign meaning, quick to judge, and reluctant to wait. The real cost was not reputational damage or professional fallout. It was a reminder that privacy, once breached, must be actively reclaimed. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Not about fame, but about boundaries. In an era where everything can be recorded and nothing is forgotten, the most radical act may be restraint. The refusal to explain. The choice to let time, not outrage, decide what matters. When the judgments fade and the algorithms shift, what remains is not the clip, but the life that continued despite it. That continuation does not erase the moment. It contextualizes it. It reduces it to what it always was, a fragment, misread, overvalued, and ultimately outlived.